The Erev Pesach Shecholius B'Shabbos Sicha is a very short but very intense Sicha. In other words, it's a lot of information, a lot of data in a short space. And when I was learning the Sicha, I was like, what's the context? When would the Sicha said? How does it? And I'm struggling to actually place it. So I went into the Teres. It's actually not Teres Menachem. The Teres Menachem of this is going to come out in a week or two, Mirza Hashem, because they're going through Tavshan Lamed Daled. So I went through into Sichas Kodesh. Trying to understand the context. When was the Sicha said? This was said Yud Aleph Nisan Tavshan Lamed Beis. Sorry, Tavshan Lamed Daled. So it was the Rebbe's 72nd Yom Haledes Farbrengen, and it was quite an intense Farbrengen. And this Sicha led into a very, very intense discussion about Miu Yehudi. Very, very fiery Sicha about Miu Yehudi. But where does it start? Rebbe basically says that's a weekday, so therefore we can't, people have work, so we can't go to Meirich. And Rebbe starts talking about Shalom V'Darshim B'Inyanei HaChag. They have to discuss the Yom Tov 30 days before the Chag. And the Rebbe asks a question: is it a separate, independent idea, or is it a chana for the Chag after it? And the Rebbe says that specifically this question about is the takana of Shalom V'Darshim and Inyan B'fnei Atzmai or Achana comes expressly out in this year, Tavshan Lamed Daled, which was the same Kviyas as this year, that Erev Pesach was on Shabbos. But the Rebbe says, "Vas Kviyas Shamzu," the setup of this year is Erev Pesach Ol B'Shabbos. So there's certain things that we would have to do in Erev Pesach, but because of the Kviyas, we do things differently. Mechiras Chametz, B'dikas Chametz, and then the Rebbe says that leads into Tainis B'Chodim. It should have also been Erev Pesach, but because of the Kviyas of this year, we put it on 2 days before, Thursday. In Lubim Kekula, most people are Yetzer with a Siyum, and the Siyum Machman Echtanishtik, you make the Siyum on Thursday. And then comes the question, never says, what is the din if somebody, for whatever reason, didn't make the Siyum on Thursday, and didn't fast? The Rebbe over here says, Mitzat Shikha, he forgot, Einas, whatever reason it is. And then the Rebbe says, if we say that after the takana it's inyan b'fnei atzmai, ein loy takana, it's over. Oid mizal zagen as das is manit v'achonetz Pesach, darf machen a siyum Shabbos. He should make a siyum on Shabbos. Fast and terminate Shabbos. Aber a siyum megmen das machen. So that's interesting. The Rebbe, when the Rebbe said this, he started off differently. He didn't ask right away. The question is, should he fast on Friday? The question is, should he make a siyum on Shabbos? And then the Rebbe says that leads to another question, chidudi, to sharpen the mind. Why didn't you have a siyum on Shabbos? And then you wouldn't have to push off the fast. That's 2 days before the time that Hashem killed B'chai Mitzrayim. We already do it a day early, but why do you have to do it more than that? On Shabbos itself, you'll say the fact that Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim. The Rebbe then goes, and that was the foundational question. And then the question leads to the next point, and that is, should he fast on Friday? So it's interesting how the Rebbe, when the Rebbe said the Sicha and the Rebbe built the Sicha later on into an essay, it's quite different. And the Rebbe asks the question, as we learned in the Sicha, even if he made a siyum on Thursday, Friday, why shouldn't you fast on Friday? The Rebbe says, Kovet Shabbos, bewarnt men ob es ist da eine andere Brede. Aber ob es ist nicht da keine andere Brede, weil Jomai schön weggegangen und Shabbos teuer nicht fast, aber machen a siyum Freitag. Rebbe says, technically, he could still fast on Friday. Und mezet doch meine Gesals, man macht das siyum yom heim, der mit dieser Yotzi. You don't have to fast on Friday. A siyum on Thursday is enough. And then the Rebbe goes that the fact that this year is also Purim, Tesvav Shecholius B'Shabbos, and the Rebbe connects Purim and Pesach, and then the Rebbe asks the question, on the 15th of Adar, who's in the Ir Mukefes Chema, does he have to hear the Megillah and Yudalid, as we learned in the Sicha. For me, I always find it fascinating if you've been following us learning the Sichas together, to go back and actually see how the Rebbe said it. Sometimes, for me at least, it offers a lot of clarity. Ader says the Shalaf Arket, when they get to Tainis Bechorim, Arab Gebdach der Minig, as their father fast far and zun. So, like the Rebbe said, the father fasting for the son. Should he fast? Should he fast in this scenario? Now, interesting. The Rebbe then goes into a Gershonis Gayer, which in the look at the Sichas version, at least in the Pnim, the Rebbe doesn't actually address it, but the Gershonis Gayer becomes a very, very foundational idea that the Rebbe discusses. He brings up Rus and her learning Torah before she was a Neviah, and that actually led into the whole question of Mir Yehudi. So so it's just interesting how, again, in the original Sicha it was all about Giyur, and after that the Rebbe kind of takes out the Giyur in this burden. The Rebbe says, interesting, that explains how Rus was able to say, Ba'asher telchi elech, she told Naomi, wherever you go, I'll go, elekecha elekai, with all the details. But truth is, how did she know everything? She should have only known Sheva Mitzvah Noach. Anything more than that, she was not allowed to learn. Und sie ist doch gewenak Sheira. And we know she was a kosher because the end proves that she was a Ger Sedek, and David HaMelech came from her. So it's understood, the fact that she learned everything, including Tchum Shabbos and all the stuff that she knew, which technically Goy should know, shows that if they're learning it in order for the Geirus, then it's okay. Because she decides, and therefore she wants to go on that journey, it's not only Akdama, but it itself is allowed, and it's a chiyuv, which is quite an interesting thing when it comes to Gir. And then the Rebbe connected that to the beginning and the end of the Masechtes Megillah, which interesting, like kind of made it a siyum on Maseches Megillah, the beginning and the end. Because in the beginning of Megillah talks about what days you could do it, and the Shel Medosh and Nanechag at the end, etc. And then, as we said, the Rebbe then goes in to the whole thing of Giyur. In other words, yes, we're allowed to learn it, etc. But Giyur has to be Kalacha, and then the Rebbe goes and speaks very harshly about the politicians who are willing to sit in their seats, even though such a disaster has never been. And the Rebbe goes on the famous war, Milchemes Hashem, that the Rebbe waged against the issue of Mir Yehudi.